Chiara walked slowly through the streets of Milan, feeling the night's chill embrace her body, but it was something else that weighed on her chest. A familiar, constant emptiness. The sound of her footsteps echoed between the buildings, while the streetlights danced on the water's reflection in the canals. It was a night like many others, but something inside her felt different.
Something was about to change.
She had spent the entire day brooding over the last argument with Andrea, her boyfriend. He was a charismatic, intelligent man with that charm that always attracted attention. But behind it, he hid sharp words, capable of cutting deep. During breakfast, while they were arguing about something trivial, he said, "You are so insecure, Chiara. I really don't know how you manage to do anything without me." Those words echoed in Chiara's mind as she walked. It wasn't the first time Andrea had said something like that. He belittled her often, but he would later appear with flowers or a dinner invitation, as if that could erase everything. She tried to believe he did it out of love, but lately, something inside her screamed that this wasn't normal. When she reached her friend Giulia's house, she was greeted with a warm hug. Giulia was her safe haven, someone who could listen without judgment. The apartment was small and cozy, and the aroma of chamomile tea filled the air. Sitting on the sofa, Chiara began to pour her heart out. "Andrea said again today that I don't do anything right. He always makes me feel so incapable. But maybe he's right. Maybe I really don't know how to do anything on my own." Giulia sighed deeply before replying. "Chiara, do you hear what you're saying? He's manipulating you. This is emotional abuse. You need to get out of this relationship." Chiara lowered her gaze, nervously fidgeting with her hands. "I know it's not right, but it's not just with him. My mother used to say the same things when I was a child. She never believed in me, you know? And now it feels like I'm reliving all of it with Andrea." Giulia leaned forward, intrigued. "Have you ever thought that this might be connected? That the way your mother treated you is repeating itself in your relationships?" Chiara was silent for a moment. The idea seemed frighteningly plausible, yet confusing. After all, how could her mother be linked to this? "Do you really think there's a connection? That all this comes from hers?" Giulia nodded. "I do think so. And look, I'm not a therapist, but I know someone who can help you. Have you heard of Family Constellations?" Chiara looked up, curious. "I've heard the name, but I've never really known what it is." Giulia smiled, trying to explain. "It's a therapy that helps you understand the patterns we inherit from our family. Things we repeat without even realizing. I did a few sessions with Anna, an incredible therapist. She helped me understand so much about myself and my father. Maybe she can help you too." Chiara hesitated. Alternative therapies weren't exactly part of her routine, but she felt so lost that anything seemed better than continuing to feel this way. "Do you really think it can work?" "I don't know. It sounds a bit strange." Giulia held her hand firmly. "I don't just think, I'm certain. You've got nothing to lose, Chiara. Talk to Anna. Give it a chance." After taking a deep breath, Chiara picked up her phone and saved Anna's number. Still doubtful, she sent a short message. "Hello, my name is Chiara. Giulia recommended you. I'd like to schedule a session if possible." Her phone buzzed almost immediately. The reply came quickly. "Of course, Chiara. I have an opening tomorrow at 6 p.m. Will that work for you?" Chiara confirmed and put her phone away. She felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Something inside her knew she was about to confront an uncomfortable truth. Giulia, noticing the tension on her friend's face, smiled. "It's going to be okay. You deserve to feel free, Chiara. You deserve to be happy." Those words echoed in Chiara's mind as she walked back home. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling while memories of her childhood flashed through her mind. Her mother, Marta, criticizing her for a school project that wasn't perfect. Marta, scolding her in front of the family for forgetting to set the table. And her father, always silent, as if he were absent even when he was present. Does it all start with her? Chiara whispered, almost unconsciously, before drifting off to sleep. Chiara hadn't slept well that night. Every time she closed her eyes, fragments of her childhood came rushing back, the incessant criticisms from her mother, Marta, and the cold silence of her father. By the time the sun rose, she already felt exhausted, as though the night had brought no rest. She spent the day trying to focus on work, but her thoughts kept circling back to that question. What if it really all begins with her? At 6 p.m., with her heart beating faster than usual and her hands cold with tension, she stood in front of Anna's office door. It was a small and welcoming space, with light-colored walls and simple decor. The soft lighting and the scent of lavender created a calming atmosphere. Anna greeted her with a warm smile, the kind that instantly puts anyone at ease. "Welcome, Chiara. Please have a seat. Tell me, how can I help you today?" Chiara hesitated. She wasn't used to talking about herself in this way, and finding the right words felt harder than she had imagined. Her hands fiddled nervously with her bag's zipper as she searched for something to focus her gaze on. Then, she took a deep breath and began. "I'm not sure how to explain.
I feel like I'm stuck in something.
I always end up with people who hurt me, and I think it has something to do with my mother. Since I was a child, she made me feel inadequate. And now, it feels like I'm reliving all of that with my partner." Anna nodded, keeping her gaze fixed on her. There was something in her presence that encouraged Chiara to continue, as if she could finally say everything without fear of judgment. "Tell me about your mother. What was your relationship like?" Chiara fell silent for a few moments, organizing her thoughts. Talking about Marta was never easy. "My mother,
Marta.
she was always very demanding. Nothing I did was ever enough. If I got a good grade in school, she would say I could have done better. If I made a mistake, it was the end of the world. And my father, he never said anything. He would just sit there in silence, as if he didn't want to get involved. I spent my whole life trying to please her, but I never succeeded." Anna listened intently, tilting her head slightly, as if trying to capture every nuance. "And your father? How do you feel when you think about him?" Chiara remained silent for a moment. She didn't think about her father much. He had always been a faint, almost invisible presence. "I don't know. He was there, but it felt like he wasn't. Sometimes, I wished he would defend me, say something to my mother. But he never did. I think he was afraid of her. I was too." Anna nodded again, as if piecing together an invisible puzzle. "Chiara, sometimes we carry stories within us that don't entirely belong to us. Have you ever heard about how family patterns can repeat across generations?" Chiara shook her head slightly. "I've heard of it, but I don't really know what it means." Anna smiled and began explaining gently. Family constellation therapy is a method that helps us see these dynamics. Often, we're stuck in patterns inherited from our parents, grandparents, or even earlier generations. These patterns influence how we relate to others and to ourselves. What we'll do today is look at your story from a new perspective. Are you ready? Chiara nodded, though she felt a slight knot in her stomach. She didn't know exactly what to expect, but there was something in Anna's voice that made her feel safe. Anna brought out a table with some figurines and symbolic objects. She asked Chiara to choose one to represent herself and another to represent Marta. Chiara chose a small, fragile figure for herself and a tall, imposing one for her mother. Now, place them on the table where you feel they belong. Don't overthink it. Follow your instinct. Chiara placed Marta's figure in the center of the table, upright and dominant, while her own figure stood off to the side, almost on the edge. "This is how I feel. Distant. Like I could never reach her," Anna observed carefully. "And your father? Where is he in this image?" Chiara picked another figure and placed it behind Marta, almost hidden. He was always behind her, as if he didn't really exist. Anna looked at the arrangement and gently asked, "How do you feel when you look at this image?" Chiara felt a heaviness in her chest.
Pain.
"It feels like I always had to fight to be seen, but I never could." Anna paused, giving Chiara time to process. Then she spoke calmly. "Chiara, what I see here is a dynamic of control and absence. Your mother occupied a lot of space, and your father seemed absent. You grew up trying to fill that emptiness, trying to gain attention. And often, when we seek relationships, we tend to replicate these same dynamics." Chiara nodded slowly. Those words began to make sense, but they were hard to accept. So, Andrea is like my mother? Is that why I chose him? Not consciously. But yes, we often connect with people who make us relive old wounds in an unconscious attempt to heal them. Chiara felt a lump in her throat.
It was painful but enlightening.
And how do I change? How can I break free from all this? Anna smiled, a smile full of hope. The first step is to see it, and you're already doing that. The next step is to let go of the weight that isn't yours. But it's a process, Chiara. We'll do it together. Chiara left the office with her mind brimming with thoughts. She walked slowly through the streets, feeling the cold air on her face. Something inside her had shifted. It was as if she was beginning to see the world and herself with new eyes. When she got home, she found an old family photo. Marta was in the center, with her impeccable posture. Her father stood next to her, almost on the margins. And Chiara, younger, smiled with an expression that now seemed forced. She picked up the photo and placed it on the table. Looking at it, she whispered to herself, I need to do this. For myself. The past few days had been like a storm for Chiara. Since her last session with Anna, nothing seemed the same. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing truths that had always been there, but she had never wanted to see. Every word from Andrea, every memory of her mother, Marta, seemed to surface with a new meaning, painful, yet inevitable. And this awareness, while strengthening her, also left her confused, as if she were walking through unfamiliar territory. It was a gray morning when Andrea called her. His voice, initially gentle, carried a slight tension. Chiara, can I come over to your place today? You've seemed distant for days. I'm worried. Chiara hesitated. She knew Andrea had noticed her change, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to face him. Or maybe she was. She took a deep breath and replied, Yes, you can come. I'll be expecting you later. When Andrea arrived, he was carrying a paper bag. He walked in with his usual disarming smile and showed her what was inside. I brought your favorite apples. I thought a bit of sweetness might cheer you up. Chiara managed a faint smile, taking the bag and placing it on the table.
Thank you.
But the apples aren't the issue, Andrea. He raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. Oh, then what is the issue? I feel like something hasn't been right lately. What's going on? Chiara felt her heart race. Every fiber of her being urged her to avoid confrontation, to leave things as they were. But that inner voice, which had grown stronger after her session with Anna, whispered that it was time to speak. I've been thinking a lot, Andrea, about us, about our arguments, and I've realized I can't keep ignoring how you make me feel. He sat down, crossing his arms. The gentle smile was replaced by a defensive expression. Oh, I see. This is one of those moments where I'm the villain, isn't it? Chiara swallowed hard. It was difficult to continue, but she knew she had to. I'm not saying you're a villain, but you need to understand that, many times, your words make me feel small. As if nothing I do is ever enough. Andrea laughed, a short and sharp laugh. Chiara, do you realize what you're saying? I'm the only one who's always been by your side. Who else would put up with all your insecurities and doubts? If it weren't for me, where would you be now? Those words felt like a punch to the stomach. Andrea had always been skilled at turning things around, making her feel guilty for all their problems. But this time, something inside her broke. Anna's words echoed in her mind. You're repeating a pattern that isn't yours. Maybe you're right, Andrea. Maybe I am insecure. But you don't have the right to make me feel wrong. I don't need someone who keeps me small to feel big. He slammed his hand on the table, though his voice remained controlled. So, that's it? Now I'm the problem? Maybe you should look in the mirror before blaming others. Chiara felt the tears burn in her eyes, but this time, she didn't back down. For the first time, she didn't let her emotions take over. Maybe you're right. Maybe I do need to look in the mirror. But I know that with you, I'm losing myself a little more every day. And I can't keep doing that. Andrea tried to argue, but Chiara got up and went to her bedroom, closing the door behind her. She sat on the floor, leaning against the bed, and let the tears fall. But it wasn't a cry of defeat. It was a liberating cry, as if a huge weight was finally beginning to lift. That night, Chiara called Giulia. She needed someone to talk to, someone who could understand. Her voice was calm, but filled with emotion. "Giulia, I think I've ended things with Andrea." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Giulia's warm and reassuring voice came through. "Really? What happened?" Chiara told her everything. The argument with Andrea, the words exchanged, and her decision to walk away. Giulia listened attentively without interrupting, and when Chiara finished, Giulia responded with a smile in her voice. "Chiara, I'm so proud of you. I know it must be hard, but it sounds like you're finally taking control of your life." "Yes, but I still don't feel free. Even without Andrea, there's something that still holds me back. It's as if all of this is still inside me." Giulia thought for a moment. "Maybe it's time to talk to Anna again. It seems like you're in the middle of a big change, Chiara. She can help you understand this better." Chiara agreed.
She knew Giulia was right.
The next day, she booked another session with Anna. When she arrived at the office, Chiara immediately felt calmer. The lavender fragrance, the soft lighting, Anna's smile, everything made her feel safe. "Chiara, it's so good to see you again. How are you feeling?" Chiara hesitated, searching for the words. "I ended things with Andrea. Or, at least I think I did. It was so hard, but I felt like I had no other choice." Anna nodded understandingly. Sometimes making those decisions is the only way to create space for something new. "Tell me, how did you feel during this process?" Chiara told her everything. The argument, the conflicting emotions, and the strange feeling of relief mixed with emptiness. Anna listened intently, never interrupting. When Chiara finished, Anna leaned forward slightly. "Chiara, what you've described is a moment of awareness. You recognized something that wasn't right and took action. But to truly understand what's behind this, we need to look more deeply at your relationship with your mother. Are you ready to continue?" Chiara took a deep breath and nodded. Anna brought out the board with the figurines again. She asked Chiara to recreate the family setup from the previous session and add a figurine for Andrea. Chiara placed Andrea next to Marta, as if they were one and the same. "He's next to her because he makes me feel like she does. He's just like her." Anna nodded. "And now, if you had to place a figurine to represent yourself, but in the position where you'd like to be, where would you put it?" Chiara picked a figurine and placed it far from Marta and Andrea, but standing tall and strong. "I'd like to be here. Far away, but strong." Anna smiled. The fact that you can imagine yourself in a different place already shows that you're ready to create something new. "Let's start from here." Chiara left the office with a renewed sense of lightness. As she walked through the streets of Milan, she looked up at the gray sky above her. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. The chapter ends with Chiara thinking to herself, "Maybe I really can change. Maybe I really can be free." Chiara felt that something significant had shifted after her last session with Anna. For the first time in her life, she could see the patterns that had been holding her back. It was liberating yet terrifying at the same time. Still, she felt like she was in the middle of a labyrinth. Each step she took seemed to open new doors, and each door revealed more questions than answers. It was a cold morning when Chiara received a message from Anna, inviting her to participate in a group family constellation session. The therapist explained that while individual sessions were powerful, group dynamics could bring even greater clarity by allowing her to see her emotions and relationships represented by others. Chiara hesitated. She wasn't someone who liked sharing her pain in public. But something inside her told her that this was important, that it might hold the key to understanding what was still keeping her bound. So, with a mix of curiosity and fear, she agreed. On the day of the constellation, Chiara arrived at the venue a little early. It was a simple but welcoming hall, with chairs arranged in a circle and soft lighting that created a calm atmosphere. Other participants were already there, sitting quietly or chatting softly. Anna greeted her with a warm smile. "I'm glad you came, Chiara. This is a safe space. Everyone here is searching for answers, just like you." Chiara nodded, trying to calm her nerves. She chose a chair near the window and observed the other participants. There were people of all ages and backgrounds, each carrying their own stories, their own burdens. She felt a wave of empathy and, at the same time, a growing curiosity about what these people were facing. Anna began the session by explaining the process. A group constellation works like a mirror. Each of you will have the chance to explore a personal issue, and the other participants will help represent the figures in your story. You don't need to worry about what to do or say. Just trust the process. The body often knows what the mind cannot understand. Chiara listened attentively, but still had doubts. How could a stranger represent her mother, her father, or even herself? But as she watched the first constellations unfold, she began to grasp the depth of the method. In the first exercise, a woman named Laura chose to work on her relationship with her sister, which she described as cold and distant. Anna selected participants to represent Laura, her sister, and their parents, and what unfolded before Chiara was astonishing. The chosen representatives acted and reacted so spontaneously and sincerely that it seemed as though they were channeling the emotions of Laura's family. The air in the room felt heavy with emotion, and Chiara felt a lump in her throat, even though she didn't know the woman. When it was her turn, Chiara felt her heart race. She wasn't entirely sure what she wanted to address, but she knew it all started with her mother. She stood up and, with a trembling voice, began to speak. I feel like I've always tried to please my mother, but I was never enough. Everything I did seemed wrong, and that feeling has stayed with me. I want to understand why I feel this way. Anna nodded with an encouraging look. Let's work with that, Chiara. Choose someone to represent you, and someone to represent your mother. Chiara glanced around hesitantly. She chose a delicate-looking young woman to represent herself, and a woman with a rigid posture to represent Marta, her mother. Then Anna asked her to choose someone to represent her father and position the figures in the center of the circle. When Chiara finished arranging the representatives, the visual impact was immediate. Marta stood at the center, tall and imposing, while Chiara was in a corner, her body curved inward. The father figure was placed behind Marta, almost invisible, just as Chiara had always seen him in her memories. Anna observed the setup and asked, Chiara, what do you feel when you look at this? Chiara took a deep breath, trying to hold back her tears. This is how I've always felt. Small, distant. Like there was no space for me. My father was never really there, and my mother, she filled everything. There was no room for me. Anna nodded and asked the representatives to express what they were feeling. The woman representing Marta began to speak in a cold, severe tone. I do this because I want you to be perfect. I cannot accept flaws because they remind me of my own failures. Chiara shivered. Although she knew the words were coming from a stranger, they sounded exactly like something her mother would say. The father's representative, on the other hand, remained silent for a long time before finally speaking in a low, hesitant voice. I'm not strong enough to face her, so I hide. Those words hit Chiara like a blow. That was precisely how she saw her father, a man who had abandoned the battlefield, leaving her alone with Marta. Anna observed the scene and asked Chiara, is there anyone in your mother's story who might have influenced her behavior? Perhaps her parents? Chiara thought for a moment and remembered something her grandmother had mentioned once. My grandmother always said my mother had a difficult childhood. Her father was very strict, and her mother didn't show affection. Anna asked for 2 representatives to be added for Marta's parents. When they were positioned, the dynamic shifted. Marta, who had seemed so strong, began to show signs of vulnerability. The representative for her mother looked at her and said, I didn't know how to love you. I was lost in my own suffering. Marta began to cry. The weight seemed to pass onto her parents, and Chiara felt a mixture of pain and relief. For the first time, she saw her mother as a person, not just the authoritarian figure who had hurt her. Anna turned to Chiara and said, what you're seeing here is a cycle of pain that has been passed down through generations. Your mother didn't know how to do things differently because she never received the love she needed. But you have the power to break this cycle. You can let go of this burden. Tears streamed down Chiara's face. She didn't know exactly how, but she felt she was beginning to understand. She was starting to free herself. When the constellation ended, Chiara sat back down, exhausted but strangely lighter. As she stepped out of the hall, the cold night air felt fresher, cleaner. She felt as though something inside her had shifted. The chapter ends with Chiara walking slowly through the streets, thinking to herself, "If I can see it, maybe I can change it. Maybe I can be free." Chiara felt a heaviness in her heart as she left the group Family Constellation session. Despite the sense of lightness the session had brought her, the emotional weight of what she had uncovered still clung to her. For the first time, she saw her mother, Marta, not as an unreachable, authoritarian figure, but as someone who carried her own pain, shaped by a history of suffering. Still, this clarity brought new challenges, the biggest one being learning to set boundaries. The next morning, Chiara woke up early. She spent several minutes staring at the ceiling, reflecting on how her relationship with Marta had influenced every aspect of her life. For so long, she had stayed silent, accepting the criticism, trying to please, even when she knew it was impossible. But now, she realized she couldn't live like that anymore. She felt the need to speak with Marta. Sitting at the kitchen table, holding a steaming cup of tea in her hands, Chiara picked up her phone. Marta's name was right at the top of her contact list. She knew making the call would be difficult. Marta wasn't the type to engage in deep conversations. Typically, Chiara's attempts ended with her mother becoming defensive or changing the subject. But this time, Chiara was determined. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the call button. Marta answered on the third ring, her voice formal and composed as always. "Chiara, what a surprise. Is everything okay?"
Hi, Mom.
"Yes, everything's fine. Actually, I was wondering if we could meet. I'd like to talk to you." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marta seemed hesitant.
Talk.
"About what? You know how busy I've been." Chiara swallowed hard, trying to remain calm. "It's something important to me, Mom. I promise it won't take much of your time." "Fine. We can have lunch tomorrow. But make it quick. I have a lot of commitments." Chiara agreed, trying not to let her anxiety show. When she hung up, she sat still for a few minutes, thinking about what she would say. She felt this was her chance to open a dialogue, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The next day, Chiara arrived at the restaurant earlier than the scheduled time. She chose a table in the corner, away from the noise, to ensure they could talk without interruptions. Marta arrived punctually, impeccably dressed, with that attentive and critical look Chiara knew so well. "Chiara, dear, is everything okay? You seem different." It was a typical comment from Marta, tinged with a concern that felt superficial. Chiara took a deep breath before replying. "I'm fine, Mom. I've been going through some changes and doing a lot of reflecting." Marta raised an eyebrow as she picked up the menu, taking her time. "Changes? I hope you haven't made any rash decisions. You know how impulsive you tend to be." Chiara felt the subtle sting of criticism in the comment, but instead of retreating as she usually did, she decided to press on. "Actually, Mom, that's what I wanted to talk about. How I often feel about your words and actions." Marta set the menu aside and looked at Chiara with curiosity, but also with a hint of defensiveness. "Oh, I see. So now you're going to blame me for something? You know everything I've ever done was for your own good." Chiara clasped her hands under the table, feeling the familiar tension rise within her. But this time, she didn't let it consume her. "I know, Mom, and I'm not here to blame you. I'm here because I need you to listen to me. For a long time, I felt like I wasn't good enough for you. Like no matter how hard I tried, I could never meet your expectations. And that's been really hard for me." Marta stayed silent for a moment, as if processing the words. Then she crossed her arms and replied coolly, "I always wanted the best for you, Chiara. If I was hard on you, it was because I had to be. The world isn't kind. Do you think you'd have made it this far without my guidance?" Chiara felt a lump in her throat. It was exactly the kind of response she had expected, but it still hurt to hear. Even so, she held her ground. "Maybe, Mom, but the issue isn't what you wanted. It's how it made me feel. I grew up thinking I had to be perfect to be loved. And that has affected me more than you realize." Marta leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Chiara. So now I'm to blame for all your problems? This is so typical. Mothers always get the blame. Chiara felt tears forming, but didn't let them fall. She needed to stay composed. It's not about blame, Mom. It's about understanding. About me finally being able to say how I feel without fear. I don't want to fight with you. I want to try to build something different. A long silence fell between them. Marta seemed uncomfortable, but didn't dismiss Chiara's words. After a few moments, she reached for her purse, perhaps as a way to change the subject. But Chiara knew she had planted a seed. If this is important to you, Chiara, I can try to listen. But I'm not promising I'll change. You know how I am. It was a small step, but Chiara felt it was significant. For the first time, Marta hadn't completely dismissed what she had to say. That evening, back home, Chiara reflected on the conversation. She felt exhausted, but also proud. There was something powerful about finally expressing what she had always kept inside. She felt strong, as if she had taken the first big step toward breaking the cycle. She picked up her phone and sent Anna a message, telling her what had happened. Anna replied almost immediately. I'm proud of you, Chiara. Setting boundaries is one of the most important acts of self-love. Let's talk more about this in our next session. Chiara smiled. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was taking control of her life. She knew the road ahead would still be long, but now she was certain it was possible. The chapter ends with Chiara watching the reflection of the lights on the window as she whispers to herself, I can change. I can be free. Chiara felt that her conversation with her mother had been a turning point in her life. For the first time, she had faced Marta without complete fear, speaking about what she had carried in her heart for years. But while the moment had brought her a sense of relief, the restlessness lingered. Marta wouldn't change overnight. Perhaps she never would. And even with the small openness her mother had shown, Chiara knew she still had much internal work to do. The days that followed were confusing. Chiara began to realize that, throughout her life, many of her choices, relationships, and even how she viewed herself had been shaped by the expectations and judgments she had absorbed from her mother. It was as if she had spent decades looking at herself through a distorted mirror, one that reflected only imperfections. One morning, as she was having breakfast, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marta, something rare, as her mother usually preferred formal phone calls. The message read, Do you have time for dinner tonight? I'd like to continue our conversation. Chiara read the message several times, trying to understand Marta's intentions. Could her mother really want to open up? Or was this an attempt to regain control of the narrative? A whirlwind of emotions swirled within her, but she decided to accept the invitation. She knew that, as difficult as it might be, this dialogue needed to continue. That evening, Marta chose an elegant restaurant, the kind of place Chiara knew her mother loved. When she arrived, she saw Marta already seated at the table, impeccable as always, with a glass of wine in front of her. Chiara took a deep breath and walked over. Hi, Mom. Marta looked up and smiled. A smile Chiara recognized as restrained, almost rehearsed. Chiara, dear, I'm glad you came. I ordered some wine for us. It's your favorite. Chiara sat down, trying to relax, but the tension in the air was palpable. They talked about light topics for a few minutes until Marta got straight to the point. About what you said the other day. I've been thinking about it. Chiara was surprised. Marta rarely admitted to reflecting on anything personal. Before she could respond, Marta continued. I don't understand why you feel that way. I've always wanted the best for you. Maybe I was harsh, but it was out of love. And, frankly, I think you're exaggerating. There it was again. The same old Marta, justifying her actions and invalidating Chiara's feelings. But instead of retreating, as she had in the past, Chiara decided to stand firm. Mom, I know you believe you did what was best. And maybe from your perspective you did. But what I'm trying to say is that it hurt me. The love you thought you were showing felt very different to me. Marta crossed her arms, a look of resistance appearing on her face. So, you're saying I failed as a mother? That everything I did was wrong? Is that it, Chiara? Chiara felt tears forming, but she took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I'm not saying you failed. I'm saying I grew up feeling like I was never enough, like I had to be perfect to be loved.
That's how I feel, Mom.
And I need you to hear me, even if it's hard." A long silence fell between them. Marta seemed to be wrestling with herself, deciding how to respond.
Finally, she sighed.
"I don't know how to respond to that, Chiara. Maybe I did what I was taught. My mother was the same way, you know that. Maybe I just repeated what I lived." It was the first time Marta had admitted something so personal. Chiara felt a mix of empathy and sadness. She wanted to hug her mother, to say everything would be okay, but she knew the moment was still fragile. "I understand, Mom, and I'm not asking you to change overnight, but I am asking that we try something different, that we listen to each other without judgment. Can we try that?" Marta nodded slightly, but said nothing. The rest of the dinner continued in silence, and Chiara realized she had touched on something deep. Perhaps her mother needed more time to process. After dinner, back home, Chiara felt emotionally drained. She wanted to believe that this small step was the beginning of something new, but she also knew her mother might never be able to offer the kind of love and validation she had always sought. And that was something Chiara would need to accept. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Anna, summarizing the dinner and asking for an extra session. She felt the need to talk about what was happening before her emotions overwhelmed her. Anna replied quickly, offering an appointment for the next day. When she arrived at Anna's office, the welcoming atmosphere helped her relax. She sat on the sofa and began speaking before Anna could even ask. "I spoke with my mother again. She even admitted some things, but I can't shake the feeling that it will never be enough. It feels like there will always be this distance between us." Anna listened attentively without interrupting. When Chiara finished, she responded calmly. "Chiara, what you're doing is incredibly difficult. You're confronting years of family patterns. It's natural to feel like the other person may never be able to give you what you need. But the real question is, can you give it to yourself?" Chiara sat in silence, reflecting on Anna's words. It was true. She had spent her life seeking validation from others, from her mother, from partners, even from friends. But she had never stopped to consider if she could be the source of the love and acceptance she so desperately wanted. "I don't know if I can, Anna. I'm so used to depending on others for that. How do I even begin?" Anna smiled. "It's a process, Chiara. It starts with small actions, small gestures of self-love. Setting boundaries, like you did with your mother, is one example. Recognizing your emotions, allowing yourself to feel without judgment. Every step you take, even if it feels small, is an act of caring for yourself." Chiara nodded, feeling a sense of lightness growing within her. It was as if, for the first time, she was beginning to understand that the freedom she sought was in her own hands. As she left the session, the streets of Milan seemed brighter, even under the gray sky. As she walked, she felt a mix of fear and hope. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but she was ready to keep going. The chapter ends with Chiara looking at the reflection of the lights on the canals and whispering to herself, "Maybe I don't need her to change. Maybe I can be enough for myself." Chiara woke up with a restless mind. Throughout the night, confusing dreams had filled her sleep, like disconnected pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Memories of her childhood, arguments with Marta, and even recent moments with Andrea played like a film in her mind. As she got up, she knew it would be an important day. It felt as if something inside her was ready to change, or perhaps break free. After getting dressed, Chiara picked up her phone and saw a message from Andrea. It was the first time he had reached out since their last argument weeks ago. The message read, "Can we talk? I think we need to resolve things." Chiara stared at the phone for a long time. Part of her wanted to ignore him. Andrea represented everything she was trying to overcome: control, insecurity, and the toxic patterns that had kept her trapped. But another part of her, more curious, knew she needed to confront this chapter of her life to move forward. She replied with a brief, "We can meet this afternoon." Hours later, they met at a quiet cafe, the same one where they'd had their first date. Andrea was already seated when Chiara arrived. He looked up, and his smile was as charming and confident as ever. For a moment, Chiara wondered how she had fallen in love with him. He had that magnetism that made her overlook his flaws. But now, with everything she had learned, it was as if she was seeing Andrea in a new light. "Hi, Chiara. I'm glad you came," he said, standing up to greet her. Chiara nodded and sat down, maintaining a distance that hadn't existed before. Andrea ordered a coffee, and the initial silence between them was broken only by the sound of cups being placed on the table. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Andrea began calmly. "About what you said last time. I think I understand you better now." Chiara frowned. It was rare for him to admit something like that, and it put her on alert. "Oh? What do you understand now, Andrea?" He took a deep breath before responding. "That maybe I was too hard on you. That sometimes I pushed you in ways that weren't fair. But you know how I am. I just wanted us to be better together." Those words might have sounded sincere to the Chiara of the past. But now, they felt like an attempt to smooth over the control he had always exercised. Chiara knew she couldn't continue this cycle. "I appreciate you recognizing that, Andrea. But the issue isn't just what you did. It's what I allowed. For a long time, I accepted things I shouldn't have because I thought I needed you. But I don't." Andrea looked at her, surprised. He wasn't used to this version of Chiara, stronger, more self-assured. "So what are you saying?" he asked, his tone wavering between irritation and disbelief. Chiara felt her heart race. It was time to say something she had long known was necessary but had feared. "I'm saying we can't continue together, Andrea. We're not healthy for each other. And I need to prioritize myself now." Andrea fell silent, and his expression shifted. It was as if he was trying to process her words while searching for an argument to counter them. "Chiara, we had good moments. You can't just throw it all away. I can change if that's what you want." Chiara shook her head, holding back the tears that threatened to surface. "It's not about you changing, Andrea. It's about me. I need to learn how to be happy with myself before I can be with someone else. And that's something I can only do on my own." He sighed, clearly frustrated. "I don't understand why you're doing this. It feels like you've completely changed, like you've decided we don't need each other anymore." "Because I've changed," Chiara replied firmly. "And for the first time, it feels like a good thing." A long silence fell between them. Andrea finally nodded, but his gaze showed he still didn't fully accept her decision. As he stood to leave, he said something Chiara would remember. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Chiara. Even if it's not with me." She stayed at the cafe for a few more minutes, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Ending a relationship was never easy, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't just the end of something. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Returning home, Chiara found a message from Marta. It was an unexpected invitation. Her mother wanted her to come over to help organize some old boxes over the weekend. For some reason, Chiara felt it might be important. Marta rarely asked for help, especially with something so personal. On Saturday, Chiara went to the house where she had grown up. The place was almost the same as she remembered, but it felt smaller, more burdened with memories. Marta was in the basement, surrounded by boxes filled with photos, documents, and old belongings. "You're finally here. I was starting to think you wouldn't come," Marta said with a faint smile. Chiara approached and began helping her open the boxes. The first contained old photo albums, many of which Chiara had never seen. There were pictures of Marta as a young woman, smiling alongside people Chiara didn't recognize. "Who are these people, Mom?" Marta looked at the photos with a mix of nostalgia and sadness. "Those are my parents, and they're my sister. She died young, before you were born. It was a very difficult time for all of us." Chiara remained silent, absorbing the information. She had never known much about Marta's childhood, and now she was seeing a side of her mother that was rarely revealed. "Why have you never talked about this?" Marta shrugged, as if it were obvious. "I don't like talking about the past. It doesn't change anything, and maybe I just preferred to forget." Chiara realized there was a deep pain there, one Marta had never allowed herself to confront. She wanted to ask more, but she knew the moment needed to be handled gently. "That must have been really hard for you, Mom. I didn't know." Marta sighed and continued sorting through the boxes. Chiara felt that something significant was about to emerge, but she decided to wait until her mother was ready to speak. As they organized the items, they came across an old letter written by Marta's mother. Chiara read a few lines and realized the letter was full of criticisms, much like the ones Marta often directed at her. "You always said your mother was strict, but I didn't realize it was like this." Marta took the letter and read it silently. For a moment, she seemed vulnerable, almost fragile. "Now you understand why I am the way I am," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Chiara placed a hand over her mother's. "I understand, Mom, and I know you did the best you could, but I also know we can be different. We don't have to keep carrying this weight." Marta didn't respond, but her eyes glistened with tears. For the first time, she seemed to truly hear Chiara, not just with her ears, but with her heart. The chapter ends with Chiara leaving Marta's house, feeling that something important had shifted. As she walked through the streets, she thought to herself, "The cycle can be broken. Maybe not for her, but for me." Chiara woke up that Sunday with a strange sensation, a mix of relief and anticipation, as if she were about to turn the final page of a book that would forever mark her life. The past months had been a deep and challenging journey, filled with confrontations with her mother, painful breakups, and discoveries about herself. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was finding her own voice. As she sipped her morning coffee, sunlight streamed through the window, warming the room in a way that felt symbolic. Chiara knew this was a new beginning. There was still much to do, wounds to heal, but she felt that something inside her was finally aligning. She had scheduled a final session with Anna, not to conclude her healing process, but to consolidate everything she had learned. Glancing at the clock, she realized it was time to leave. When she entered Anna's studio, the familiar scent of lavender and the soft lighting brought Chiara a sense of comfort. She felt at home in this space, a place where her deepest emotions had been seen and heard. "Chiara, it's so good to see you. Come in, have a seat," Anna said with her usual warm smile. Chiara settled into the couch, crossing her legs and taking a deep breath before speaking. "Anna, I don't even know where to start. These past months have been transformative. I still feel vulnerable, but also stronger than ever." Anna nodded, encouraging her to continue. "You've been on an important journey, Chiara. Tell me, what do you feel has changed in you since the beginnings?" Chiara paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts before responding. "I think I'm finally understanding who I am. I spent years trying to please my mother, trying to meet everyone else's expectations. I lived with the feeling that I had to be perfect to deserve love. But now I see it's not like that. I can be loved as I am. And more importantly, I can love myself." Anna smiled but said nothing, giving Chiara space to continue. "Of course, my relationship with my mother is still complicated, but I've realized that I don't need to change her. I just need to understand that she has her own pains and limitations. I can't change the past, but I can decide how it will affect me in the future." Anna leaned forward slightly, looking directly into Chiara's eyes. "What you just said is very powerful, Chiara. Recognizing that your mother is a person with her own wounds, while also setting boundaries, is one of the greatest acts of maturity anyone can achieve. But I want to ask you something. Do you feel ready to forgive her?" Chiara fell silent, reflecting. Forgiveness was something she had always found difficult, not because she held on to resentment, but because it felt like accepting everything that had happened. "I think I am, Anna. But it's not the kind of forgiveness that erases the pain. It's a forgiveness that acknowledges what happened and chooses to move forward. I can't change what I've lived, but I can choose not to carry the weight anymore." Anna smiled, visibly pleased with her response. "That's what we call liberating forgiveness. It's not about the other person, it's about you. And I feel like you're truly ready for this freedom." As Chiara left the session, a cool breeze brushed her face, contrasting with the warm afternoon sun. She wandered aimlessly through the streets of Milan, letting her thoughts flow. She remembered the conversation with her mother in the basement, the moment Marta had admitted, even subtly, that she too was a product of a painful history. She thought of Andrea and the strength she had found to end that relationship. Each moment felt like a small step toward rebirth. When she arrived home, Chiara decided to organize some of her own old boxes, inspired by what she had done with Marta. She found letters from school friends, journals filled with insecurities, and even some photos with Andrea. At another time, these memories might have made her cry or feel paralyzed, but now there was a different sensation: gratitude. She picked up one of the photos, one of her and Andrea during a beach trip, and stared at it for a long time before placing it back in the box. "Thank you for being part of my story," she murmured to herself. "But now I need to move on." A few days later, Marta called. Her voice sounded different, calmer. "Chiara, I was thinking maybe we should have lunch together." "No rush, just the two of us." Chiara was surprised but accepted the invitation. On the scheduled day, they met at a small restaurant away from the bustle of the city. Marta was more casual than usual, without her rigid posture. During the meal, they talked about various topics, but at the end, Marta brought up something unexpected. "I know I haven't always been a good mother," Marta began, staring at the napkin in her hands. "But I want you to know that, despite all my mistakes, I've always loved you." Chiara felt a lump in her throat, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from emotion. This was something she had waited her entire life to hear. "I know, Mom, and I love you too. Despite everything, I love you." The two sat in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence of understanding, of acceptance. For the first time, Chiara felt like she didn't need anything more. That small exchange was enough. Later that night, as she wrote in her journal, Chiara reflected on everything that had happened. It wasn't a perfect conclusion, but it was real. Her journey wasn't about achieving idealized happiness or solving all her problems. It was about learning to walk lightly, even while carrying the marks of the past. She wrote her final words of the day before closing the journal. "Freedom isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without losing yourself." The chapter ends with Chiara looking out the window of her apartment, watching the city lights sparkle in the distance. She closes her eyes, takes a deep breath, and whispers to herself, "I am enough." Chiara sat at her kitchen table, watching the steam rise from her cup of tea. The morning brought a comforting silence, broken only by the distant hum of Milan's traffic. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a golden glow over the room. She gazed at the cityscape with a mix of relief and anticipation. Though she had achieved significant inner growth, she knew her journey was far from complete. A new challenge lay ahead: how to live fully without falling back into old patterns. The past months had been an emotional roller coaster. Every conversation with Marta, every session with Anna, every step toward emotional independence had seemed to open new doors within her. Now, Chiara was at a point of transition. She felt ready to integrate everything she had learned, turning her reflections into tangible actions. But what did that truly mean? That morning, Chiara decided to take a walk. She needed fresh air to clear her thoughts. As she strolled through Milan's bustling streets, she caught the familiar scent of coffee wafting from bakeries and the sound of trams clattering in the distance. The city seemed to pulse around her, mirroring the energy she felt within. With no specific destination in mind, her steps led her to a small bookshop tucked between two old buildings. She had passed it countless times, but had never ventured inside. That day, an inexplicable curiosity drew her in. Walking through the narrow aisles, her eyes landed on a book whose title seemed to speak directly to her: Breaking the Cycles, Discover Who You Are. The simple yet compelling cover made her smile. Without hesitation, she picked up the book and flipped through its pages. The words leapt out at her as if they had been written just for her. Feeling that it was a sign, she walked to the counter. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged woman with gray hair and a warm smile, commented as she wrapped the book. "This book is special. It changes lives. I hope it helps you." Chiara smiled back, feeling an instant connection to those words. She left the shop holding the book close to her chest, as though she were carrying a small treasure. Back at her apartment, Chiara settled onto her sofa with a cup of tea and began reading. The book's opening pages were profound and captivating, exploring how family experiences shape who we are and how we can free ourselves from those patterns without rejecting our history. Every word seemed to speak directly to her. At one point, she came across a passage that made her pause and reflect. True emotional freedom doesn't come from rejecting who we were, but from embracing every part of ourselves, even the wounds. Chiara closed the book for a moment, staring out the window. She had spent so much time trying to free herself from Marta's influence, pushing away the weight of her history, that she hadn't realized the true path to healing lay in accepting all those parts. Perhaps the next step wasn't just forgiving her mother, but forgiving herself for carrying those burdens for so long. She resumed reading, underlining passages that resonated deeply. One concept that stood out to her was, real change happens when we stop fighting the past and start using it as a foundation to build the future. That afternoon, Chiara decided to try one of the exercises suggested in the book. She took a piece of paper and created 2 columns. In the first, she listed everything she felt she had lost or sacrificed because of her relationship with Marta. In the second, she wrote what she had learned from each experience. As she filled in the columns, something began to shift within her. She realized that while her story contained pain, it also contained strength. For example, she wrote, "Loss. Believing I had to be perfect to be loved. Lesson. I discovered that true love begins with accepting who I am, imperfections and all." The exercise brought tears to her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release. Next, she followed another step from the book, writing a letter to her future self as a commitment to continue nurturing her journey. The letter began, "Dear Chiara, I'm so proud of who you are becoming. I know the road won't always be easy, but I want you to remember that you are enough, just as you are. Keep walking, even if it's slowly, because every step is worth it." Later, as she tucked the letter into her journal, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marta. "Chiara, I'm tidying up the last things in the basement. I found something I think you'd like to see. Can you come by tomorrow?" Chiara was surprised. It was rare for Marta to suggest a casual meeting, especially with such a light tone. She felt a warmth in her chest, as though their relationship was beginning to transform in a genuine way. She replied that she would go. The next day, Chiara arrived at her mother's house and found Marta in the basement, surrounded by boxes. The scene was familiar, but the atmosphere felt different. Marta held an old photo album and smiled when she saw Chiara. "I thought you might want to see this." Chiara approached and saw that the album was filled with pictures from her childhood. Some were moments she remembered. Others were completely new to her. In one, Marta was holding Chiara as a baby, looking at her with a tenderness Chiara didn't associate with the mother she knew. "You were my joy," Marta said softly. Even if I didn't know how to show it the right way, Chiara felt tears welling up in her eyes, but this time, she didn't try to hide them. She took her mother's hand. "Thank you, Mom, for showing me this, for trying." Marta nodded without speaking, but the silence between them was heavy with meaning. For the first time, it felt as though they were walking in the same direction, making a mutual effort to rebuild. As Chiara left Marta's house that afternoon, she looked up at the sky and felt a peace she had never experienced before. It wasn't perfect, and she knew challenges lay ahead, but it was real. A peace that came from within. Walking through Milan's streets, with the sunset glowing in the distance, Chiara thought to herself, freedom isn't the absence of pain. It's learning to live fully despite it. The chapter ends with Chiara entering her apartment, placing the photo album beside her journal, and whispering, "I am enough. I always have been." The days following her visit to Marta's basement brought Chiara a sense of relief she hadn't felt in a long time. Despite the challenges that still lingered, something inside her felt lighter, more connected. She was finally understanding that the path to healing wasn't about reaching a final destination, but about learning to live with authenticity and balance, even while carrying the marks of the past. Still, she knew her journey wasn't over. She needed to integrate the new Chiara that was emerging with her relationships and choices in life. That morning, as she prepared her coffee, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Julia.
Chiara, how are you?
I've missed you so much. Let's meet up? I want to hear everything and share some news too. Chiara smiled as she read the message. Julia had always been an important figure in her life, not just as a friend, but also as the one who introduced her to Family Constellations. It was Julia who encouraged her to see Anna when Chiara felt lost and overwhelmed by her mother's demands and complicated relationships. During her therapy process, however, Chiara had distanced herself, diving deep into her inner journey. Now, she felt it was the right time to reconnect. She quickly replied, arranging to meet at a cafe in the city center. When Chiara arrived, Julia was already there, her face lit up by a warm smile as she held her phone. Seeing Chiara, she immediately stood up and hugged her tightly. Finally, Chiara, it felt like you disappeared off the map. Chiara laughed, feeling the comforting familiarity of Julia's presence. It's true, I pulled away a bit. I needed some time for myself. But here I am. Julia smiled as they sat down. The first few minutes were filled with light conversation, updates on Julia's work, funny stories about mutual friends. But at some point, Julia leaned forward, her tone turning serious.
And you? How are you?
You seem different, calmer, more confident. What's happened these past months? Chiara took a deep breath, feeling the emotion rise. It was time to share what she had been through. Julia, you're the one who set me on this path, and I don't even know how to thank you for that. I started Family Constellations with Anna, and it changed my life. It was an intense, difficult process, but I finally feel like I'm finding myself. Julia smiled, visibly moved. Really? Oh, Chiara, that makes me so happy. When I told you about it, I just had this feeling it could be what you needed. But tell me, how is it for you? Chiara stirred her coffee, organizing her thoughts. At first, it was like opening a door to a place I didn't even know existed. Seeing my relationship with my mother so deeply was painful, but liberating. Realizing how family patterns repeated in my life, how all of it influenced my relationships, was scary. But now, I feel like I'm beginning to break those cycles. It's like I'm finally becoming myself. Julia nodded, her eyes shining with pride. That explains so much. I always felt like you were carrying something so heavy, and now I see you're really letting go of that burden. Chiara smiled, grateful for Julia's support. I'm still on the journey, but I finally feel like I'm moving in the right direction. I don't want to live trying to please others or meet their expectations anymore. I want to live for myself. After the coffee, Chiara returned home with a light heart. Talking to Julia reminded her of the importance of having the right people on her journey. It was Julia who had planted the first seed of change, and now Chiara felt ready to give back to their friendship with the truest version of herself. The next day, while tidying up her drawers, Chiara came across a flyer for an emotional communication course that Anna had mentioned during a session. At the time, she hadn't paid much attention, but now it felt like the right opportunity to continue growing. The course promised to teach ways to express feelings clearly and connect with others more genuinely. Without overthinking it, she signed up. On the first day of the course, Chiara entered the room with a mix of nerves and curiosity. The group was small, made up of people of different ages and backgrounds. The instructor, a man with a warm smile and a calm voice, began by asking each participant to share what they hoped to learn. When it was Chiara's turn, she took a deep breath and spoke honestly. I'm here because I want to learn how to communicate in a truthful way without being afraid to show who I am. I've spent so much time hiding, trying to avoid conflicts or disappointing others. Now, I want to build relationships that are based on authenticity. The other participants listened attentively, and Chiara felt that this was a safe space to be herself. During the session, they did a partner exercise. Each person was asked to share something vulnerable with their partner. Chiara was paired with an older man named Roberto. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated for a moment, but then decided to open up. For many years, I lived trying to please my mother. Her opinion felt like the most important thing in the world. But I realized that by doing that, I lost sight of who I really was. And now I'm trying to reconnect with myself. Roberto nodded, offering a kind smile. I understand that more than you might think. I spent decades trying to be the perfect father and husband. It's only recently that I realized there's no such thing as perfection, but there is space to be truthful. You're on the right path. Roberto's words stayed with Chiara for the rest of the session. She felt she was learning to build connections based on sincerity, something that felt both new and natural. A few days later, Chiara received an unexpected call from Marta. Her mother's voice was softer than usual. "Chiara, I've been thinking about what you said about us. I know it's taken me a while, but I want you to know I'm trying. I don't know if I can change completely, but I want to try." Chiara felt tears streaming down her face as she listened. It wasn't a grand promise, but it was a start. And for Chiara, that was enough. "Thank you, Mom. That means so much to me. And I want you to know that I'm learning too. We can do this together, step by step." That night, Chiara wrote in her journal. She reflected on everything that had happened since Julia introduced her to Family Constellations. She wrote her final words before closing the notebook. "Healing is a journey, not a destination. And every day I choose to walk it, I come closer to who I truly am." The chapter ends with Chiara looking out her apartment window, watching Milan's lights glow in the night. She takes a deep breath and whispers, "I am enough. I always have been."